At 7 minutes past noon, Vivian Blackwood fired Elias Rowe in the middle of the executive dining room, in front of engineers who had trusted him for years. She called him an obstacle, tore up his access badge, and ordered security to walk him out of Blackwood Aeronautics within the hour. Elias set his lab keys on the table and said only, "Do not let Ether 1 leave the ground." 43 minutes later, 3 screens in the control center turned red. The aircraft lost synchronization between its flight computers, and Vivian's phone lit up with the 41st call to the man she had just destroyed. If you want to see exactly how a single afternoon turned a fired engineer into the only person who could save 6 lives and an entire company, stay with this story and tap subscribe before the next call comes through. Elias Rowe arrived at Blackwood Aeronautics before sunrise that morning, long before anyone else had touched their coffee, because he wanted one more look at the final test data from Ether 1 before the afternoon demonstration. Ether 1 was the company's newest long-range aircraft, built around a triple-layer digital flight control system that executives had spent 2 years calling the most important program in the firm's history. That same afternoon, Vivian planned to fly a delegation from a major international transport company, and if the flight went well, a contract worth $4.2 billion would be signed before the markets closed. Elias was the chief safety engineer, the man who had designed an independent verification system called Sentinel Gate, built specifically to catch any unauthorized change made to the aircraft's control software. That morning, Sentinel Gate flagged something wrong. A software package called Firmware 7.4 had been installed on the aircraft at 11:51 the night before, and its verification code did not match anything the safety team had approved. Gavin Thorne, the company's chief operating officer, told Elias it was nothing more than a minor patch and asked him to sign off on flight readiness immediately. Elias refused because the update had never gone through thermal stress testing, signal interference testing, or backup computer failover testing, the 3 checks that stood between a working aircraft and a guessing one. Gavin warned him that his stubbornness could cost thousands of people their jobs if the contract fell apart. Elias answered quietly that one wrong signature could cost the company far more than that. Gavin leaned against the doorframe of the lab, arms folded, and reminded him that every other engineer on the floor had already signed off on smaller uncertainties without making a production out of it. Elias told him that other engineers agreeing with something did not make it correct, only common. Before he left the lab that morning, he sent his daughter, Sadie, a short message telling her he might be home late, a small ordinary moment before everything else began. Gavin did not argue further. He simply picked up his phone, called Vivian directly, and told her that Elias S. was holding the entire deal hostage over what he called an unproven theory. Vivian listened to Gavin's account without asking a single question of her own safety team, a habit she had carried for years without ever seriously questioning it. To her, Gavin represented steadiness, the executive who always found a way to keep programs moving forward, no matter how many obstacles piled up along the way. She trusted his read of a situation more than she trusted the caution of engineers who, in her experience, tended to see risk everywhere they looked. Beneath that trust sat an old family expectation she rarely spoke about out loud, the sense that a Blackwood did not let hesitation cost the company a deal of this size. Her grandfather had built the company from a single hangar and 2 second-hand aircraft, and every generation since had been measured against that legacy. Vivian had spent her entire career trying to prove she belonged at the head of that legacy rather than simply inheriting a chair with her family name already carved into it. By noon, Vivian had assembled the executive team, senior engineers, and the visiting client representatives in the same dining room where the fate of the company would soon be decided. Elias was summoned under the pretense of resolving a technical disagreement. Vivienne placed the readiness form in front of him and told him to sign it there, in front of everyone, without further delay. Elias explained calmly that firmware 7.4 could cause the aircraft's 3 flight computers to report 3 different altitude readings the moment the system switched to backup power. Gavin interrupted, calling the warning an unproven guess dressed up as caution, and reminded the room that Elias had once requested a 6-week delay on the very same program, a fact he twisted to make Elias sound like a man dragging his feet on purpose. Vivienne asked him directly whether he could guarantee the aircraft would fail. Elias told her he did not need a guarantee that it would fail, only the honesty to admit he could not guarantee it was safe, and that admitting that was the entire point of his job. The client representatives shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that made it clear they were quietly reconsidering the confidence they had walked in with that morning. Vivienne felt the room tilting away from her, the deal she had spent months courting suddenly hanging on the calm, unshaken words of a man she outranked by every measure that mattered inside the building. To her, standing in front of a client who controlled billions of dollars in future orders, the answer felt like a public challenge to her authority rather than a warning worth hearing. She accused him of letting personal caution cloud his judgment at the worst possible moment. Elias reminded her that caution was not a flaw in his job description. It was the entire reason the position existed in the first place. Vivienne's voice hardened as she told him that engineers who could not adapt to the pace of the business had no place shaping its future. At 7 minutes past noon exactly, she fired him on the spot and ordered security to collect his badge, her words landing flat and final across a room that had gone completely silent. A few engineers lowered their eyes to the table, none of them willing to speak in his defense, though more than one of them had privately shared his concerns the week before. Elias did not raise his voice or ask for a second chance. He simply set his lab keys down, looked directly at Vivienne, and told her that she could fire him, but she should not let Aether 1 take off. Vivienne answered that a company could not be run by a man who had just been dismissed, and Gavin immediately instructed the flight crew to proceed exactly as scheduled, eager to close the matter before anyone else in the room found the courage to speak up. The elevator doors closed behind Elias, and 12 minutes later, Aether 1 began rolling toward the runway. He had no way of knowing that Gavin had quietly disabled part of the Sentinel gate system so it would not automatically block the flight. On board were Mara Quinn, the company's lead test pilot, a co-pilot, 2 flight engineers, and 3 client representatives who had flown in to witness the demonstration firsthand. Vivienne stayed behind in the control center to monitor the flight from the ground, confident the crisis had ended the moment Elias walked out the door. The aircraft lifted off at 16 minutes past noon under a clear afternoon sky, and for the first 3 minutes, everything appeared completely normal. Then flight computer number 2 began reporting altitude readings that disagreed with the other 2 systems, small at first, then growing wider with every passing second. The aircraft had not lost control, but it had begun flickering between its normal operating mode and a defensive backup mode meant only for genuine emergencies. Inside the control center, a junior engineer noticed that Sentinel Gate had, despite being partially disabled, still logged the unauthorized firmware installation in its background records, a quiet trail no one had thought to erase in time. Vivienne stood near the main console, arms crossed, still telling herself that the disagreement between screens was nothing more than routine calibration noise, the kind every new aircraft produced during its early hours of flight. At 19 minutes past noon, 3 primary monitoring screens turned red at almost the same instant, and the calm in the room evaporated all at once. Mara radioed down that the autopilot had disengaged on its own and a synchronization warning had appeared across the cockpit displays. Her voice remained level, trained through years of handling exactly this kind of pressure, but the words themselves left no room for reassurance. Gavin assured Vivienne that a pilot of Mara's experience could manage the aircraft manually without any trouble, his tone smooth in a way that suddenly struck several people in the room as rehearsed rather than reassuring. One of the flight engineers quietly pulled up the maintenance log from the previous night and noticed the installation timestamp for the very first time. But the technical team uncovered something far more dangerous buried in the data. If the aircraft's power system shifted to its backup supply while the 3 flight computers remained out of agreement, the entire range of pilot commands could become severely restricted at the worst possible moment. Vivienne demanded the testing file for firmware 7.4 and was told, to her disbelief, that no such file existed. Gavin claimed Elias had simply never finished it. A young engineer, gathering more courage than his position usually allowed, spoke up and said Elias could not have finished it because Gavin had ordered the firmware installed before testing had even been scheduled to begin. Vivienne turned pale and demanded someone call Elias immediately. The first call went out at 20 minutes past noon. Elias saw her name appear on his screen and let it ring through to silence. After the way she had treated him less than an hour earlier, he assumed she was only calling to pressure him into signing away his own liability before the company's lawyers got involved. High above the city, Ether 1 received a command to shift onto its backup power system, and for several agonizing seconds, it simply refused to respond. Vivienne kept calling while her staff scrambled to find anyone who could take Elias's place. Warren Ashford, the board's legal counsel, delivered the fact that finally silenced the room. Elias held an independent safety authorization granted directly by the board years earlier, a power that did not automatically transfer to anyone else the moment he was terminated as an employee. The only other person with the technical authority to intervene at that level was Mara Quinn, and she was thousands of feet in the air, fighting to keep the aircraft level. No one could simply borrow Elias's credentials or forge his signature without violating federal aviation law, and even if they could, what the company actually needed was not a password. It needed his understanding of how Sentinel Gate had been built and how to isolate a failing computer without shutting down the 2 that were still working correctly. Elias let the second call go unanswered, then the 3rd, then the 10th. He listened to one voicemail from Gavin demanding he return immediately to, as Gavin put it, clean up the mess he had left behind. The accusation only hardened his resolve not to answer, since the same man now begging for his help was the one who had dismissed his warning only hours earlier. He pulled his car into a small diner near the airport, ordered black coffee he never touched, and opened his personal laptop to review a backup copy of flight data he was authorized to keep as part of the company's own safety protocol. His hands were steady even as his stomach tightened with every new line of data that confirmed what he had feared that morning. Reading through it, he realized with a cold certainty that Ether 1 had been allowed to take off despite the fact that Sentinel Gate had never actually cleared it for flight. For a brief moment, he considered simply letting the company face the consequences of ignoring him, a thought he dismissed almost as quickly as it arrived, because 6 people who had nothing to do with the decision were still somewhere above the clouds. He placed a call to the board's independent safety reporting line, a channel built specifically to bypass any single executive who might try to bury a warning, though he still had not spoken to Vivienne directly. Outside the window of the diner, a waitress refilled cups at other tables, entirely unaware that the man in the corner booth held information that could determine whether an aircraft full of strangers made it home. Inside the control center, the call count climbed past 18, then 25, then 33. Word of the incident began leaking out, and Blackwood's stock price started sliding within minutes. The visiting client representatives, watching from a conference room, warned that the entire agreement would be canceled if the aircraft did not land safely. Augustus Blackwood, Vivian's uncle and the chairman of the board, arrived and demanded she pressure Elias into signing a written statement accepting full responsibility, a demand aimed less at solving the crisis than at protecting the family name. For the first time in years, Vivian noticed that the people around her were still thinking about money while 6 human beings remained trapped in the sky. The 40th call went out at 59 minutes past noon, and Elias still let it ring through. This time, Vivian set aside the statement Gavin had drafted for her and recorded something entirely her own. She did not mention the contract, the falling stock price, or her family's reputation. She said simply that she had been wrong, that people were on that aircraft right now, and that she was asking him, not ordering him, to please help them. The clock rolled over to 1 in the afternoon as Vivian placed the 41st call. His phone rang for the 41st time at exactly 1 o'clock, and this time Elias answered. Vivian did not give orders. She admitted, plainly and without spin, that Ether 1 was suffering a synchronization failure between its flight computers. Elias asked whether the aircraft had been running firmware 7.4, and when she confirmed it, he understood immediately that the danger was worse than anything the control center had realized on its own. The firmware itself would not directly bring the aircraft down. Instead, it caused one flight computer to believe the aircraft was tilted 3 degrees further than it actually was. The moment the system switched power sources or encountered interference, that computer would try to correct an error that never existed in the first place. Elias asked Vivian to read him the exact wording of every warning on the screens, not a summary filtered through Gavin, because he had learned years earlier that paraphrased warnings tended to lose the one detail that actually mattered. She read each line slowly, stumbling over unfamiliar technical terms, while Elias listened with his eyes closed, building a picture of the aircraft's condition entirely from her voice. Gavin reached for the phone to take over, insisting he could summarize things faster, but Vivian pulled it back and refused to let him, a small gesture that told the room exactly whose account she trusted now. Elias agreed to help, but only under 4 conditions. First, the demonstration flight had to be officially declared a technical emergency. Second, every server holding relevant data had to be frozen immediately, with no one permitted to alter or delete a single file. Third, Warren Ashford had to confirm in writing that Elias was acting as an independent safety commander, not as a recalled employee bound by ordinary instructions. Fourth, Gavin Thorne had to be removed from the control center until the cause of the failure was fully understood. Vivian pushed back hardest against that last condition, since Gavin was the person she had trusted above everyone else in the company. Elias told her plainly that if she still valued protecting Gavin more than protecting the people on that aircraft, she was free to hang up the phone. A long silence followed. For the first time in years, Vivian faced a choice between personal loyalty and a process built to keep people alive, and she ordered security to escort Gavin out of the room. Gavin protested loudly, accusing Elias of exploiting the crisis for revenge. Vivian told him flatly that the man who had just been fired was trying to save the aircraft, while Gavin appeared only interested in saving his own position. Warren sent the written confirmation within minutes. Elias began directing the technical team on what data to gather, while refusing to allow any restart command to be sent to the aircraft until he was physically present. Vivian offered to send a helicopter to bring him in faster. Elias declined, since the drive back would take only 10 minutes, and a helicopter would only slow things down. He ended the call with one final sentence that settled the new balance of power between them. Once he walked through that door, she would no longer be the one making the technical decisions. Vivian agreed without argument. While Elias drove back toward the building he had been marched, Out of less than an hour earlier, Flight Computer Number 2 issued its first faulty command of the crisis. Elias reached the gates of Blackwood Aeronautics at 11 minutes past 1. The same guard who had escorted him out less than an hour before now had to open an emergency access point just to let him back in. His employee badge had already been deactivated, but Warren had granted him clearance under his authority as an independent incident commander instead. He walked back through the very dining room where he had been humiliated in front of colleagues who now avoided his eyes entirely. Elias did not stop to scold anyone or savor the moment. When he entered the control center, Vivian rose from the head seat without being asked and stepped aside. Elias did not take her chair. He moved instead to the safety command station at the front of the room, a small gesture that told everyone present exactly what he wanted and did not want. He had no interest in her authority. He only wanted the authority to do his job correctly. He asked to be connected directly to Mara. She reported that manual control was still holding, but the resistance in the control stick had begun behaving strangely, shifting in ways that did not match normal aerodynamic feedback. Elias instructed her to hold a stable altitude, avoid switching power sources, and resist any urge to reboot the entire flight system at once. Members of the technical team suggested simply shutting down Flight Computer Number 2. Elias overruled them, explaining that firmware 7.4 had quietly altered the voting order the three computers used to decide which readings to trust. Shutting the faulty computer down at the wrong moment could trick the remaining two into treating its bad data as the primary source of truth instead. He asked for access to the original source code archive, pulling up the exact version he had personally approved weeks earlier during his final inspection. Line by line, he compared it against the version currently running on the aircraft, searching for the smallest discrepancy that might explain what the flight computers were doing. The comparison showed that one command line had been altered after his own final inspection, a change so small it would have been easy to miss without knowing precisely where to look. And that change carried a digital signature belonging to an operations department administrator account. Gavin, still waiting outside the room under guard, immediately demanded a lawyer and denied any involvement whatsoever, his composure slipping for the first time since the crisis had begun. Vivian began to understand that Elias had not simply been cautious about an unproven risk. Someone had deliberately worked to hide a real one. Elias refused to let the investigation distract from the more urgent problem in front of them. Finding who was responsible could wait, he said, but either one could not. He laid out a plan to isolate the faulty computer by feeding it a carefully constructed sequence of simulated data that would cause it to voluntarily withdraw from the voting process among the three systems. To carry it out, Mara would need to bank the aircraft to a precise angle and hold it there for only a few seconds, a maneuver where even a small miscalculation could push the response in exactly the wrong direction. Mara reported that they had only 17 minutes before deteriorating weather reached the backup airfield they were now heading toward. Elias guided Mara through every step in the same steady, unhurried voice he used for routine testing. Vivian stood just behind him, watching for the first time as an entire room followed a man's instructions purely because of what he knew, without any title or threat attached to the request. The maneuver called for the aircraft to bank 8 degrees to the left, hold that position for 3 full seconds, then return smoothly to level flight. The brief difference between the false data and the real data would be large enough to force Sentinel Gate to flag Flight Computer Number 2 as an unreliable source. The first attempt failed when signal interference shortened the hold time by half a second, and the warning lights across the panel flipped from yellow to red. The client representatives seated in the cabin began to panic, but Mara calmly asked everyone to remain in their seats and stay still, her voice carrying the same steady discipline that had earned her a reputation as the best test pilot the company had ever employed. Elias took responsibility for the miscalculation without hesitation and adjusted the command sequence before the next attempt, refusing to let anyone else absorb blame for a decision that had been his to make. Vivian asked whether there was any other option available to them, her question quieter than anything she had said all afternoon. He told her honestly that the aircraft could attempt a landing under a severely restricted control mode, but the runway ahead of them was too short to safely support that configuration. She understood, in that moment, standing beside the man she had fired only hours earlier, that there was no hidden button that made every risk disappear. Every choice they had left still carried some danger with it, and the only real difference now was whether the people making those choices were honest about the danger or not. On the second attempt, Mara held the exact angle required, and Sentinel Gate successfully isolated Flight Computer Number 2 from the voting system. The aircraft was not yet fully normal, but the two remaining computers were now in complete agreement with each other. Ether 1 began its descent toward the backup airfield as planned. When the landing gear extension command was sent, a new warning appeared on the power distribution system. Gavin, it turned out, had approved a replacement power converter from a supplier that had never been formally certified, and the substitution meant the power transfer was running slower than industry standard required. Elias had no choice but to instruct Mara to extend the landing gear in stages rather than all at once, a workaround that bought safety at the cost of additional time. Every extra second mattered as the storm system continued closing in on the airfield. Vivian stood in silence as she began to grasp exactly how many small shortcuts, taken one after another over recent months, had quietly stacked up into this single afternoon. Finally, all three landing gear indicator lights turned green in sequence. Ether 1 touched down safely at 2:06 in the afternoon. The control center erupted in relief, but Elias simply removed his headset and requested that the aircraft be sealed off immediately for a full investigation. Just as everyone in the room believed the crisis had finally ended, Warren discovered that someone was attempting to remotely erase data from the company servers. The cybersecurity team managed to sever the server connection before the deletion could finish. The command had originated from a company tablet assigned directly to Gavin Thorne. Gavin insisted his device credentials had been stolen, though no one in the room seemed inclined to believe him. Augustus Blackwood pushed hard to keep the entire episode quiet, worried above all about protecting the falling stock price. He proposed a deal to Elias: sign a report attributing the failure to a design flaw within Sentinel Gate itself, and in exchange, he would be reinstated, given a substantial bonus, and every record of his termination would simply disappear. This was the sharpest ethical test Elias faced all day. He refused immediately, right in front of Vivienne. A safety system built on a foundation of lies in its very first report after a crisis, he told them, was not a safety system at all. Augustus warned that Elias would never work in aviation again if he continued down this path. Vivian stayed quiet at first, and for a moment Elias assumed she had chosen loyalty to her family over the truth after all. Then she instructed Warren to release the complete meeting recording to every member of the board, without exception. Vivian openly admitted that she had fired Elias specifically to pressure him into signing a document he believed was unsafe. She admitted, too, that she had allowed the flight to proceed without final confirmation from her own safety team. Her honesty made it impossible for Augustus to bury the incident any longer. The recovered server data revealed the full extent of what Gavin had done. He had approved a supplier that failed certification standards, installed firmware 7.4 outside of normal working hours, deleted 3 separate warnings that Elias had filed, rewrote the wording of an email before forwarding it to Vivian, and used his assistant's account to make it appear as though proper testing had already taken place. Gavin no longer had any way to shift blame back onto Elias, and the confidence he had carried into every meeting that day began visibly cracking under the weight of the evidence. Instead, he pivoted to accusing Vivian of applying relentless pressure to hit her deadline, insisting that no one in his position could have resisted the demands coming down from the top of the company. Vivian did not deny it, refusing to reach for the easy comfort of pretending her own conduct had been faultless. She said her pressure never gave him the right to falsify data, but she acknowledged that the environment she created had made it easier for him to believe. Results mattered more than truth, an admission that cost her visibly in front of the very board members she needed to convince of her judgment. Warren compiled the recovered records into a formal timeline, laying out each decision Gavin had made in the hours before the flight. Beside the exact moment Elias had first raised his objection. The gap between the two told its own story, without anyone needing to add commentary. Augustus studied the timeline in silence, his earlier confidence in controlling the narrative fading, as he realized how thoroughly the digital trail contradicted every version of events he had hoped to present to the board. The board convened an emergency session and announced that both Gavin and Vivian could potentially lose their positions. Word of the closed-door meeting spread quickly through the company, and by the time the session actually began, employees on every floor understood that the outcome would decide far more than the fate of two executives. It would decide whether the company's culture continued rewarding speed over honesty, or whether the near disaster over the airfield finally forced a real reckoning. The meeting took place the following morning. Augustus proposed removing Vivian from her role while allowing Gavin to remain temporarily as an advisor during the ongoing investigation, a plan designed mainly to shield the board's own cost-cutting decisions behind a single scapegoat. Warren stood and read aloud a rarely used provision buried within the company's governance charter. Years earlier, after an earlier testing accident, the company's founder had created what the charter called the safety veto provision. The person currently holding that authority was Elias Rowe. If Elias formally declared that leadership had created a systemic pattern of danger, every ongoing test flight would be suspended immediately, and the company's insurance coverage could be placed on hold. Everyone in the room suddenly understood that the man they had thrown out of the building less than a day earlier now controlled the company's entire future. Augustus offered to install Elias as interim chief executive on the spot, his tone shifting overnight from dismissive to almost desperate. Elias declined, explaining that he was an engineer, not someone equipped to run the company's finances, and that trading one poor fit of authority for another would not fix what had actually gone wrong. Augustus pressed further, urging him to declare Vivian the sole cause of everything that had gone wrong, painting a version of events that would leave the board's own decisions conveniently untouched. Elias had every personal reason to agree with him. The memory of standing in that dining room, humiliated in front of colleagues, was still fresh enough to sting. Instead, he laid out the facts as he actually saw them, refusing to let anger write a story that the evidence did not support. Vivian had fired him wrongfully, he acknowledged, and she had placed her production schedule above proper safety procedure. But once she understood that human lives were genuinely at risk, she had handed control to the person best equipped to handle it. She had frozen the data, removed Gavin from the control center, and publicly accepted responsibility for her part in the disaster. Augustus, by contrast, had spent the hours after landing trying to cover the entire episode up. Elias concluded that the failure was not the fault of one person alone, but the product of a company culture that had quietly rewarded silence for far too long. Gavin was suspended and his file was handed over to federal investigators. Augustus was asked to step down as chairman for the duration of the audit. The board asked Elias one final question: should Vivian Blackwood remain as chief executive at all? Vivian offered no defense and made no plea for mercy. She told Elias plainly that if he recommended her removal, she would accept it without a fight. Elias reminded the room of the exact moment she had torn up his badge in front of the entire staff. He told her that her greatest failure had never been a lack of technical knowledge, but her belief that power meant she never had to listen. Even so, he did not push for her immediate removal. Instead, he laid out 6 conditions for her to remain in her position. The company would establish an independent safety council reporting directly to the board, insulated from the daily pressure of production schedules and quarterly targets. No executive would be permitted to alter flight software without 2 separate technical signatures. A deliberate barrier meant to make it impossible for any single person to quietly override a warning again. Every safety warning would be archived outside of the standard operational system, where it could not be quietly buried. Preserved in a record no executive could reach into and rewrite. Anyone who reported a risk would receive absolute protection from retaliation, a guarantee written into policy rather than left as an informal promise. Vivian herself would be required to publicly accept responsibility in front of the entire staff, not behind closed doors where the admission would mean little to the people who had actually witnessed her decision. And Elias would retain the authority to halt any test program at will, an authority the chief executive could never unilaterally revoke, ensuring that the next warning, whenever it came, would never again depend on 41 phone calls to be taken seriously. Warren read each condition aloud for the official record, and one by one, board members nodded their approval, some out of genuine conviction, others simply relieved that the company had a path forward that did not end in public collapse. Vivian signed the document without asking for a single word to be softened, aware that any hesitation now would confirm every doubt Elias still carried about her. She understood that trust, once broken in front of an entire staff, could not be repaired with a private signature alone. It would have to be rebuilt in full view of the same people who had watched it break. Vivian accepted every single condition without hesitation. Augustus mocked Elias for what he called weakness, arguing that he had wasted a perfect opportunity to destroy her career entirely. Elias answered simply that he had not saved that aircraft in order to earn the right to ruin another person afterward. The board voted to keep Vivian in place under 12 months of formal oversight. Elias was named chairman of the new Independent Safety Council and granted a long-term equity stake, a benefit written openly into the board's resolution rather than hidden as a quiet payoff for silence. One task still remained for Vivian, facing the very employees who had watched her fire Elias in that same room. Vivian gathered the entire staff in the executive dining room where she had once fired him, choosing the same exact spot rather than a stage built by the communications department. There were no press cameras, no polished script, nothing performative about it. She stood precisely where Elias had once stood and told the room, without softening a word of it, that he had been right to refuse that signature, that she had used her authority to humiliate someone for telling her the truth, and that a safe landing did not erase the wrongness of the decision that nearly prevented it. She apologized to Elias directly in front of every person watching, her voice steady even though the room around her had gone completely still. He accepted the apology, but made clear that acceptance was not the same as saying the matter was fully settled. Trust in an industry like aviation, he explained, was never rebuilt through words alone, but through thousands of correct decisions made one after another over time, long after anyone remembered this particular afternoon. A few engineers near the back of the room exchanged glances, the same ones who had once lowered their eyes rather than speak up on his behalf. Several of them stepped forward, one at a time, and admitted their own part in what had happened, describing the moments they had privately agreed with Elias, but said nothing out loud for fear of standing out. Elias did not blame them individually, understanding better than most how easily silence could feel like the safer choice in a room built around hierarchy. He insisted only that fear of losing a job could never again be used as an excuse to hide real danger, and that from this point forward, speaking up would be treated as loyalty to the company rather than defiance of it. Vivian listened to each admission without interrupting, aware that rebuilding a culture required more patience than rebuilding a single relationship ever would. Vivian handed Elias back an access badge, freshly printed, the plastic still warm from the machine. It no longer read Chief Engineer. His new title read Independent Chief of Flight Safety, a role that had not existed anywhere in the company 24 hours earlier. Elias studied the badge for a moment, turning it over once in his hand before clipping it to his jacket, and said he would carry it for as long as the company continued letting the truth pass through every door inside it. Vivian nodded, understanding the badge was not a gift, but a standard she would now be held to for as long as she remained in her position. There was no embrace, no dramatic reconciliation scene, no music swelling behind either of them. Only a handshake offered and returned between two equals who understood exactly what the other had cost and what the other had saved. A year later, Ether One completed its full testing program from the beginning and earned genuine certification for safe commercial flight, a process that took far longer than the original schedule had ever allowed for, but produced a result no one inside the company needed to defend. The $4.2 billion contract was finally signed, months later than originally planned, but this time it rested on data no one had reason to distrust, verified line by a team no single executive could quietly override. Gavin Thorne faced a criminal investigation and was permanently barred from any future involvement with the company's projects, his name quietly removed from every internal document that once carried it. Augustus Blackwood resigned from the board entirely, choosing to step away rather than answer further questions about how long he had known and how little he had done about it. Vivian remained chief executive, though her approach to leadership had visibly changed in ways that longtime employees noticed almost immediately. Before every major decision now, she made a habit of asking her safety team what she might still be missing. A question she had rarely thought to ask before the afternoon that nearly cost 6 lives. The dining room where she had once fired Elias in front of the entire staff eventually became the site of a small plaque commemorating the Independent Safety Council, a quiet daily reminder rather than a monument to any single person's mistake. Elias brought Sadie to the public viewing deck to watch Ether One's very first commercial flight take off. As the aircraft climbed steadily into a clear sky, his phone buzzed once with a short message from Vivian. It read simply that there had been no need for 41 calls this time because they had listened from the very first warning. Elias turned off the screen, watched the aircraft settle into a smooth, steady climb, and allowed himself a quiet smile. Beside him, Sadie asked if the plane was the one her father had once refused to sign off on, and he told her yes, and that refusing had been the easiest decision he ever made.